A very common question that people ask me is, what are the advantages and disadvantages of mediation?
I've been wondering that myself.
So if you've ever found yourself in an intractable conflict where mediation was proposed and you've wondered, should I even try this? This video is for you. In this video, I'm going to share with you 6 key advantages of mediation and 3 key disadvantages. And if you stick around to the end, I'll give you questions to ask yourself before deciding whether mediation is right for you. First, let me just remind you of what mediation is. Mediation is a negotiation between 2 or more parties where a third neutral party, called a mediator, helps the parties in the dispute come to a resolution. Mediations can be really formal, so think, for example, the mediation that occurred between Egypt and Israel that was conducted by former American President Jimmy Carter and that led to the Camp David Accords. Or they can be very informal. Think of an older sibling, maybe intervening to help her 2 younger siblings resolve a dispute over who has to do the household chores. Mediations occur in the workplace between employees who might be at odds with each other, or they occur in commercial contexts where parties might be in a dispute over whether services contracted were performed appropriately or whether a landlord is responsible for his tenant slipping on unshoveled snow and injuring herself. When we're thinking about whether to use mediation as a way to resolve a dispute instead of fighting it out or litigating or giving up, there are some real advantages. Let's talk through these advantages using a hypothetical conflict between the owner of a dry cleaning shop and a customer after the dry cleaner has lost a bunch of clothes belonging to the customer. In this imagined scenario, the customer claims that some of the lost clothes were custom made and extremely expensive. In addition, one of the pieces, a hand-tailored suit, had special sentimental value for the owner because it was the suit he wore at his wedding 5 years ago. Consequently, he argues the dry cleaner ought to pay him the current replacement value of the clothes, plus a surcharge to account for the emotional damage of the lost wedding suit. He actually contends he should also be paid for the hassle it will take to purchase and replace all of the lost clothes. Now, the dry cleaner, they see it really differently. Though of course she regrets the loss of the clothes, she argues that reimbursing for the replacement value makes no sense. After all, the owner himself admitted that some of the clothes, including the wedding suit, he had for several years. If those clothes were sold at a garage sale or on consignment, they'd get a really small fraction of what he paid for them and nowhere near replacement value. Plus, the dry cleaner contends, the customer has already extracted much of the value from the clothes by wearing them for so long. Demanding full reimbursement and imposing a sentimental value penalty, she suggests, is both preposterous and mercenary. So, unable to work it out, the parties are considering mediation. Now, one major advantage of mediation over other ways of resolving a conflict is autonomy. The parties in the mediation retain control over any decision that's made. If they were to pursue their claim in a court, a judge or a jury would simply impose an outcome. But the mediation allows parties to work it out themselves with the help of the mediator. This leads to the second major advantage of mediation, which is the possibility of creative outcomes. So when a dispute goes to a court or a jury, they typically just render a binary decision. One party's the winner, the other party's the loser. In the dry cleaning example, the judge might decide on a dollar amount that the dry cleaner owes to the customer. Nothing more creative is going to come from that process. But the mediation allows the parties to craft all sorts of creative outcomes based on a broader set of interests that a court just would never work with. So if we think about this dry cleaner dispute, on the surface, this is a conflict that seems to be about how much the dry cleaner will give to the customer. But in the mediation, we might learn that this is one important issue, but honestly, there are others. For example, for the customer, this is the nearest dry cleaner and it's the only one that uses organic processes on the clothes. So as upset as he is by the loss of the clothes, he actually wants to continue to use this store in the future for the owner of the dry cleaner. She cares a lot about happy customers. She doesn't want to lose this customer's business. She also worries about her reputation in the community generally. Also, truth be told, she feels embarrassed by the loss of the clothes. It's something that's only happened 3 times in the 8 years she's owned this shop. In addition, both the customer and the owner of the shop care a lot about being treated fairly. Unlike other dispute resolution processes, a mediation can unearth these interests, which then give possibility for the parties to craft win-win outcomes, even out of an unfortunate dispute like this. A second key advantage of mediation is often speed of resolution. In most jurisdictions, courts get really backed up. A dispute could take months or even years before a judge can hear it. A mediation, even a really complex one, can often be scheduled much more quickly. Another advantage of mediation is cost savings, both in terms of money, but also in terms of time and emotional exhaustion. I'm often struck by the wisdom of a quote attributed to Voltaire, who said, quote, "I have had two negative experiences with the law. In one, I lost a legal action, and in the other, I won." In addition to autonomy and speed, mediation is almost always a more cost-efficient way to resolve a conflict than litigation. One of the hardest things about processes like litigation or arbitration is that you actually have very little control over the outcome because some third party, a judge, a jury, a panel of arbitrators, they're the ones who are going to impose the decision. That lack of control and autonomy, combined with the long time it can take to get before a judge or a jury, result in really high financial and emotional costs. Yet another advantage of mediation is privacy. Most mediations are confidential in nature, and the parties can agree to keep the fact of the mediation, as well as the terms of any agreement, strictly confidential. In our dry cleaning story, for example, the owner of the store might feel ashamed and embarrassed that she lost her customer's clothes. In addition, even though it is a rare incident, if word got out, it really could hurt her reputation. Mediation is a process that allows parties to work out their differences without it becoming public. Litigation, on the other hand, is a much more public process. A final but very important advantage of mediation is increased compliance with the terms of the agreement and increased satisfaction with the agreement itself. Research has shown that when parties have a say in crafting an agreement, they're more likely to comply with that agreement as compared to when they simply have terms imposed on them. Relatedly, this research has also shown that a party that has had a role in crafting an outcome will report greater satisfaction with their outcome than a party that has an outcome imposed on them, even if the party that has the outcome imposed on them is given a better deal. As stated earlier, mediation is a process that allows, even requires, parties to craft their own outcomes and to agree to it consensually. Okay, so if there are so many advantages to mediation, you're probably wondering, what are the downsides? So let me share 3 disadvantages or downsides of mediation that come up frequently. The first is the possible replication of power differentials in the mediation process. So what do I mean by this? Well, because mediation is consensual, not based on what a court would provide or what a law would say is a person's right, it's possible that parties with less power, resources, or money might end up with the short end of the stick in a mediation. In other words, they may be willing to say yes to something that is less than what they might get through litigation, simply because they don't have the resources to keep fighting. Now, power differentials show up in ways that are more than just financial. Consider a divorce mediation, where the history of the relationship has been that one spouse tends to defer to the other's wishes. If the divorce were brought before a judge, the more deferential spouse might actually end up with a better deal than in a mediation session, where the same relationship dynamic of conceding and deferring might get replicated. There are equal concerns about this dynamic in mediations involving sexual harassment or mediations involving racial or socioeconomic differences. Academic proponents of mediation argue that those who worry about power differentials tend to overblow that concern and are often blind to the many advantages mediation can bring. While a debate about mediation in certain contexts certainly exists, I think there's a lot more nuance to some of these conversations. Mediations conducted without a sensitivity to power differentials can be problematic and ought to be avoided. It's also the case that having an absolute black line rule against mediation in family law or in harassment situations leaves a lot of value on the table, because in many situations, parties can truly achieve mutual gains across a wide range of interests, more than they can through adjudicative processes. A second disadvantage of mediation is that there would be no public accountability for wrongdoing. In 1983, then Yale Law School professor Owen Fiss penned a now famous article called Against Settlement. This article came at a moment when local and federal courts were rapidly expanding mediation programs, and alternative dispute resolution, or ADR, was the rage. Fiss's Against Settlement was the Debbie Downer on this love fest for mediation. The basic premise of his argument, in a nutshell, was that the move toward mediated settlement did a disservice to the public. Fiss argued that one of the advantages of the litigation system is that it helps create rights for those who might follow afterward, and it holds others to public accountability for wrongdoing. So by allowing individual persons to mediate, society lost the benefit of the public accounting and the creation of rights or bargaining endowments that might flow from the litigation. Fiss certainly has a point in some respects. For example, No one would argue that Brown versus Board of Education, the case that eliminated the separate but equal segregation in our public schools, should have been mediated instead of litigated. Similarly, and more recently, no one would want the 2015 Obergefell case that established a constitutional right for same-sex persons to be married to have been mediated instead of litigated. Landmark cases such as those are not ones that are appropriate for mediation, precisely because having a legal precedent fundamentally changes the bargaining endowment for everyone. We need litigated cases to establish precedent and settled law. Having said that, the vast majority of cases that are mediated are simply not establishing groundbreaking precedent. And as a result, in my view, the concerns about accountability and bargaining endowments are both worthy of consideration in an individual case, but honestly, largely overblown. Now, the last disadvantage of mediation is the possibility of the mediation failing. Not every mediation leads to an agreement between parties. Sometimes the process just doesn't work out. And when that happens, it's important to know the consequences. It may mean, for example, that you're now back into a litigation mode, meaning that you've spent time and money on a process and are right back where you were at the beginning. In some cases, the situation might be worse. The failure of the mediation could lead to even more bad feeling between the parties and a sense that somehow there was something wrong with the parties. Luckily, most of the time when I mediate, the parties actually reach an amicable agreement. And in some cases, the relationship is actually enhanced by the very process of the mediation. But this isn't always the case. One of the toughest mediations I've been involved with over the past few years ended in no agreement. Of course, that in itself would have been regrettable, but not inevitable. Unfortunately, one of the parties came away feeling as if the mediation process had ripped him of some of his autonomy and strongly reinforced his negative perception of the other side. In this case, the effect of the mediation process was actually worse than just wasting time. Relationships and trust were actually lower than they had been had there been no mediation. The important thing here is that you need to be aware of the risks and the benefits of mediation. So, with this complex list of advantages and disadvantages, how do you decide whether or not to participate in a mediation? There's no hard and fast answer to this question, but some points to consider are: first, is this a situation where individual autonomy, creativity, cost, privacy, and compliance are important issues? If so, mediation may be worth trying. On the other hand, if one of your interests is in accountability, if power differentials would strip you or the other party of general autonomy, or if the risk of failure is simply too high, then saying no to mediation might be in your interest. If you want to learn more about mediation, negotiation, and other dispute resolution procedures, keep watching these videos or take one of the classes I offer through the Cambridge Negotiation Institute. Now that you know the advantages and disadvantages of mediation, let's talk about how to formulate a negotiation strategy. Thanks for hanging out with me. I'm Bob Bordone, and let's keep negotiating together. Here's that strategy I promised.